Welcome to the Uncensored Unprofessor, a podcast where I want to think more deeply with you about Christian faith and life. Hey, all you believers, you non-believers, you unaffiliated believers, sort of believers, and even you think I'm a believers, welcome. Welcome to the Uncensored Unprofessor. During my time in high school, we didn't much discuss homosexuality or homosexual marriage. I do distinctly remember taking a class, and I can't remember the exact name, family education, family sociology. We students all knew what the name for us was, and it was sex ed. Well, that class had for its focus learning how to make a family budget, opening a bank account, discussing how not to get pregnant or catch STDs, and stuff about babies conceived outside of marriage. But clear back then, we had no idea what was coming down the societal pipe. While in some ways my high school days seem like ancient history, in the sweep of human history, that was a mere heartbeat ago. Because of the sexual revolution of the 1960s and its ever-increasing volume, there's much confusion in society about sex, and I believe a growing amount of that confusion is willful. In this episode, I want to think with believers who are interested in going a bit deeper as it concerns biblical teaching on human identity and sex. Now, please know that in earlier episodes, I discussed some of what is at stake in the contemporary societal desire to abandon a Judeo-Christian understanding of sex, specifically a biologically designed sex over against a Nietzschean willpower-designed sex. Next, I examined the foundational passages of Genesis 1 and 2. God created them male and female. Together he created them in his image. Then I discussed how and why Jesus himself maintained that ancient Jewish perspective on God's created order for human sexuality. Today we will examine the historic setting of a man who wrote approximately 28% of the New Testament, Paul the Apostle. Now, first I need to clarify something for you. Earlier, after hours and hours of study, I had laid out an entirely different episode on St. Paul, and then I had to discard that because of a new book that came across my desk. Thank you, Pastor John. Emotionally, I didn't want to format a new episode. These take time, and we all know that we get emotionally attached to the work we've done. But you know me, I love truth. I believe truth is foundational to a life well lived. Truth brings solutions. So when new evidence appeared, I scrapped that episode. And because I believe the Bible verses penned by Paul are so foundational, so critical for our contemporary setting, I've turned one episode, as I originally planned it, into two. First, today I want you to get a sense of Paul's first century setting. Was his world so different from ours? The fact is, we're told all the time that his primitive world was nothing like our sophisticated and technological era. We know so much more about human nature than did the ancients. But you know me, I never want to be guilty of chronological snobbery. Chronological snobbery is assuming that the time frame I live in is superior to all previous historic epochs. Many people today are nervous about committing cultural snobbery, which means to assume that one's culture is superior to all others, but they never give a thought to their routine chronological snobbery that they commit. I guess it's just human nature to always assume our time and location surpasses every previous place and time. I'm not sure. Anyway, was Paul's world only aware of actions but not of motives or impulses or orientations? That question is actually a critical one for whether or not some dismiss the Apostle Paul and what he wrote. Now, just to set up a quick contrast, please know that Jesus' ministry was to Jews. He talked with Jews, ate Jewish lamb dinners, quoted the Jewish Bible, and argued with educated Jewish leaders. Some of you are probably still singing my Jesus is a Jew song from last episode, right? Well, Paul's ministry, although it was clearly founded within a Jewish worldview, his ministry was to Gentiles. He listened to their philosophies and poets. He saw their religious temples, and maybe he even drank wine out of vases painted with Gentile art. Jesus, again, taught in towns, villages, and honestly, dirt-clod stops along the stagecoach line. If we went there and saw the tumble-down shacks he walked by, we'd see those communities really were not much more than dirt-clod stops. Well, Paul, he taught in towns and cities. He ate Gentile kielbasa. Go read 1 Corinthians. And Paul's approach was far more urban than Jesus. Paul's environments affected what he wrote. We shouldn't be surprised at all that Paul's accent, his flavor in presenting Christ and the gospel through his own epistles, should be characterized by Gentile more than Jewish concerns. Today we can hardly look at the entire ancient world, but I do want to note some things to you about sex and the ancient Gentile context. And with what follows, I am going to be describing, not prescribing the situation for you. I just want to be clear. The Gentile context and sex, and honestly, you may not want your kids or kids in the room to hear the following. Here's the Gentile context and sex. First, temple prostitution was practiced. Now, I've said it before and I'll say it again. What a great way to have your cake and eat it too. Sacred sex, as some scholars put it today who don't want to offend people now dead for 2,000 years, sacred sex was temple prostitution. You could worship the god or goddess and have sexual intercourse. Or one could enjoin a fertility ritual and simultaneously be crotchally fertile. Historians argue with one another about how prominent temple prostitution actually was inside cities, but it was indeed practiced. Sometimes female slaves were forced into temple prostitution. Other times, women in dire straits became prostitutes. Still other times, women of the region gave themselves to temple prostitution as a one-time offering to the god or goddess. But in each case, men would pay money to the temple system to sleep with a prostitute. But again, the Gentile world had cities with temple prostitution. There wasn't any temple prostitution in first century Israel. Secondly, women were viewed as less ideal, less valuable than men. Now, this led to different critical problems. One was infant abandonment. If a Gentile family did not want a baby girl or could not feed another baby, it was not uncommon that baby dumping occurred. The baby would be taken out to the edge of town or to a forest and simply left behind. Sometimes wild animals would seize the baby, other times slave traders would pick up the baby, but in either case, that's tough on females. Another problem related to women being less valuable than men was depopulation. If women are seen as less valuable so that boys were preferred at birth over girls, then it naturally follows that depopulation will result. To address that sticky wicket, the ancient Roman rulers gave land grants and tax breaks to nuclear families who had lots of children. Civilizations need enough people to make them work, right? And the Romans would give breaks to families to have more kids. Yet another problem regarding women involves social stigma. Men were viewed as the ideal humans. We not only get a sense of this from ancient Greek poetry and statuary and vase paintings, which repeated the male form as the ideal, but we also know that only ancient men could get an education. Ancient philosophers commonly viewed women as unclean, as lacking the strength, dignity, and even the beauty of men. Now, unfortunately, some ancient Christian theologians too often picked up on that pagan philosophy, that sensibility about women, and they reasoned that the original perfect human being in Eden was a man. For her part, Eve, those ancient Christian writers said, she was only created by God in order to perpetuate the species. Also back then, as commonly around the globe today, it was acceptable for boys to have sexual intercourse before marriage, but not girls. That women should be virgins before marital sex was a widespread belief. Third, in the Gentile context, they practiced all manner of sexual immorality. Porneia is the catch-all Koine Greek, which means New Testament Greek, phrase for this, porneia, but specific items like lesbianism, male homosexuality, male dominance, male rape, effeminacy, transsexuality, both male and female prostitution, and now I'm speaking of the Vegas, not religious style. There were orgies and pederasty, which I'll come back to in a moment. Those were all observed and written about not only by New Testament authors, but Greek and Roman ones too. Very pertinent for academic studies and discussions and even sermons about the Apostle Paul and what he writes in Romans 1 is that latter item in that list, pederasty. Pederasty was sex between men, one of whom was the superior and the other the inferior. Scholars tell us that the meaning of this could vary. The superior might be older or richer, or holding more social status or social influence. So, for instance, it was not unheard of for a teacher to have sexual intercourse with his younger pupil. Plato, perhaps the greatest philosopher in all of Western history, praised pederasty in his writing The Symposium. Across the ocean, the little sea there, the Spartans, you 300 movie fans will be intrigued here, the Spartans practiced pederasty as part of their social fabric. And pederasty was a way to build and reinforce respect and social strata and social hierarchy, social status, and it was also a way to build relationships. For his part, the ancient Roman historian Suetonius writes about Emperor Tiberius, who was emperor in the first part of the first century, quote, "Some of his criminal obscenity are almost too vile to discuss, much less believe. Imagine training little boys, whom he called his minnows, to chase him while he went swimming, and to get between his legs to lick and nibble him. The story goes that once while sacrificing, Tiberius took an erotic fancy to the acolyte who carried the incense casket, and could hardly wait for the ceremony to end before hurrying him and his brother, the sacred trumpeter, out of the temple and indecently assaulting them both." End quote. Suetonius also wrote about Emperor Caligula, who reigned from 37 to 41, quote, "Valerius Catulus, a young man of a consular family, publicly proclaimed that he had violated the emperor and worn himself out in commerce with him." End quote. Perhaps what Emperor Nero did, not surprisingly given what we know about Nero, what Emperor Nero did with a young lover notes the very extreme. Again, here's Suetonius, quote, "Having tried to turn the boy Sporus into a girl by castration, Nero went through a wedding ceremony with him, dowry, bridal veil, and all, which the whole royal court attended. Then Nero brought him home and treated him as a wife. He dressed Sporus in the fine clothes normally worn by an empress, and took him in his own litter, that means wagon, and took him not only to every Greek party and fair, but actually through the street images at Rome, kissing him amorously now and then." End quote. So pederasty was common, and it was a network of relationship involving that superior and that inferior. And we might be able to imagine why older men would be interested in younger men. They were yet unaffected by the blights and mars and afflictions of age. And remember, life was hard then. The average lifespan of those who survived death was only 30. And again, as we noted earlier, male bodies were prized as the human ideal. The older superior would want the affection, the attention, and the admiration of a younger inferior man. Older pederastic men would also like it that a younger healthy man would be beholden to them. And for their part, younger men obviously could benefit socially from these relationships. They could gain status, meet and get to know richer, more powerful, more politically connected men. So the superior was the benefactor for the inferior, but the inferior enjoyed the patronage, to put it in a certain manner, of the inferior, pederasty. Also, throughout the Gentile world, writers would note homosexuality. This was a Gentile practice. And these ancient writers frequently note that homosexuality was driven by passion. Frequently, we see this expressed in love poetry. For instance, Virgil wrote, quote, "Cruel Alexis, heed you not my songs? Have you no pity? You'll drive me to my death, beauteous boy." End quote. In the 5th century, Herodotus wrote that the Persians imbibed all manner of luxurious practices, one of which was the homosexual pederasty they learned from the Greeks. For his part, Aristotle, some 350 years before Christ, Aristotle thought he could denote an effeminate or homosexual man by his physical appearance. Aristotle wrote, "Signs of enfeebled eyes, but you should notice that weak eyes may signify softness and effeminacy, as well as dejection and low spirits. Also, a weak bearing and a weary gait. The pathic means the passive partner in male homosexual relationships. The pathic is weak-eyed and knock-kneed. His hands are carried upturned and flabbily, and as he walks he either wags his loins or else holds them rigid by an effort, and he casts a furtive glance around. And shrill, soft, broken tones mark the speech of the pathic, for such a voice is found in women and is congruous with the pathic's nature." End quote. Homosexuality was known. People were aware of that in the Gentile world. A fifth thing I want to point out as we go through a Gentile context here for Paul concerns the presence of soft men. The Greek word is malakos. Say malakos, class. Teacher, right? Malakos were observed in Gentile societies, or in the plural, malakoi. Malakoi were soft or effeminate men, and actually that word malakoi appears in Paul's first epistle to the Corinthians in chapter 6-9, and we should note that Paul uses it there without any explanation. Now, it's very possible that the apostle didn't need to explain this commonplace Greek word, because among the ancients it meant things like men who dressed up and acted like women. They might, according to the 1st century Jewish philosopher Philo, dress up like women or put on perfume and makeup like women. In the extreme cases, some of these malakoi even had themselves castrated. Others would, another scholar named Dr. Preston Sprinkle, other malakoi would shave their chest. And some Romans believed a naked chest meant the man was the receiver in homosexual sex. Although malakoi doesn't always mean homosexuality. Malakoi might have engaged in homosexual sex, and they might not have. Ptolemy, a writer who lived in the 2nd century after Christ, Ptolemy used several different terms to describe soft men, malakoi. Malakos was just one of the words that went either toward physical or temperamental characteristics for Ptolemy. Some ancients, like we saw with Aristotle above regarding homosexuality, tried to develop rubrics for recognizing the traits of malakoi, soft men. They came up with lists or ways to diagnose or discern the presence of a malakos. And finally, it's commonplace for scholars to describe malakoi, soft men, as those who were the receivers in anal intercourse. There was a lot going on in the ancient Gentile context concerning sexuality, and because of that, the ancients had a vast vocabularic span to describe this. Honestly, far from being unaware or naive about human sexuality, they knew and described all kinds of sexual behaviors. I would read you all of the Greek and Latin names exactly, but for the sake of expediency, I'll read them primarily in English. There was sex that is against nature, paraphusin, and that phrase could be used to describe homosexual acts and orientation. There was sex according to nature, kataphusin, describing heterosexual acts and orientations. There were males who penetrated other males, eromenos, males who are penetrated, women who love other women, women who are oriented toward other women's sexual companions, women who rub one another. The Latin word was frictrix or fricatrix. Lesbians, from the Greek island Lesbos, where a famed bisexual poet lived, pederasty. There were phrases for adult males in pederastic relationship, youths in a pederastic relationship, terms for love of young boys, effeminate men, men who play the role of women, that is, transvestites or man-like women, soft men, easily broken or crumbling men, and also some different terms for men who acted as women. And some of those terms go to action, and some also involve inclinations and orientations. Regarding the latter, orientation, Plato, in his famous document Symposium, Plato has Aristophanes describing human sexuality along the lines of orientation. Now, you guys, this quote is a bit lengthy, but please listen to the detail with which Plato writes. Quote, "Each of us, then, is but a tally of a man, since everyone shows like a flat fish the traces of having been sliced in two, and each is ever searching for the tally that will fit him. All the men who are sections of that composite sex that at first was called man-woman are woman-courters. Our adulterers are mostly descended from that sex, whence likewise are derived our man-courting women and adulteresses. All the women who are sections of the slice called woman have no great fancy for men. They are inclined rather to women, and of this stock are the she-minions. Men who are sections of the male slice pursue the masculine, and so long as their boyhood lasts, they show themselves to be slices of the male by making friends with men and delighting to lie with them and to be clasped in men's embraces. These are the finest boys and striplings, for they have the most manly nature." End quote. Plato, that philosopher, clearly understood that there are inclinations, hungers, and dispositions driving people's sexuality, drives that today we would call orientations. Themselves philosophers, the Greek sophists, argued amongst one another whether people develop the traits we do because of nature or nurture. Aristotle, following the sophists who went before him, Aristotle explored the same question in his Nicomachean Ethics. For their part, the ancient Greek Cynics and Stoics emphasized nature concerning human traits. Both groups believed it was the human calling to live according to nature, and they taught that nurture should be shaped to follow and pattern nature. Still, other ancient writers variously posited that human sexual orientation was due to biology or astrology, the location and alignment of the stars. What all of that evidence, and honestly samples like it some tenfold, far more than I can convey in this format, what all of that evidence shows us is that the ancients were indeed aware not only of behaviors and actions, but of passions, inclinations, tendencies, and orientations. Jesus certainly spoke that way about motives. For praying, right? He said, pray in private, not out in public where people will see you. Or we get some of that from Jesus when he talks about men who have lust in their heart for women. If you've followed the Christianity and homosexuality tumult at all, you will know that it is commonplace to hear that the ancients, and Paul the Apostle with them, were not aware of orientations, didn't know how to discuss the differences between actions and motives. In seminary, I heard such portrayals. I've even read very recently published books on the topic, and they say the same thing. The ancient people just didn't or couldn't make the kind of distinctions we make about human sex today. But in their recent book, Unchanging Witness, scholars Donald Forston III and Rolling Grams painstakingly chart out how it was indeed the case that the ancients, and with them the Apostle Paul, did in fact make such distinctions, indeed were aware of people's orientations, including folks' sexual orientations. And please know that all the quotations and terms and phrases that I read up above are from that dense book. This is important. Maybe you better fasten your seatbelt. Let me explain academic method. Now, I don't want to take you too far down the scholarly rabbit hole, but academic research works just like any other human enterprise. A first explorer blazes a trail and then explains what she or he sees. Another explorer, usually, walks down the same trail and either affirms or tweaks what they see. The second and third and fourth and 17th explorer researcher is often so full of respect for those who went before them that they reify means make more real, entrench more deeply. They reify the arguments made before, such that those arguments and explanations strengthen in the collective community over time. Please know, folks, that this reifying dynamic is not unique to biblical or historical study. We would find the very precise pattern at work in astrophysics, mathematics, biology, and psychology. Only when some new angle, some new approach, some new evidence appear will an entire discipline make a shift in its collective understanding. Think Einstein's theory of relativity. It overturned previous understandings of the universe, and astrophysicists were shaken when they had to process what Einstein proposed. The same thing happened much earlier when Copernicus put forth his astronomical findings and theories. People were shaken, but then they processed it and saw the truth of that. Forston and Grams, with their boatloads of historical unearthing and exegetical work — exegetical means historical, linguistic, grammatical investigation — those two scholars are overturning some long-established beliefs, well, in some circles anyway, about Paul in Romans 1 and 1 Corinthians 6 and 1 Timothy 1. Now, I'm going to unpack those passages in my next episode, but you need to know that earlier scholars like Sherwin Bailey, John McNeill, Victor Paul Furnish, Michel Foucault, Walter Wink, and Luke Timothy Johnson, and many others with them, in different venues for different audiences, argued that Paul neither condemned homosexuality nor understood the distinction between orientation and behavior. Following in those scholars' wake, we now have entire schools of thought on Christianity and homosexuality. But the truth is, Paul did. He did understand both orientation and behavior. Why does that matter for us? Well, it helps us know that Paul, like many other observers and intellectuals of his day, well understood his Gentile context, a context where human sexuality had not yet received God's words and laws. And into and for that context, the apostles spoke forth God's revelation, God's word, that sexual intercourse is reserved for a man and a woman inside marriage, just as Jesus taught, and that God's design for human sexuality is heterosexual, inside a marriage. That was a lot. That was a lot of unpacking, you guys. That's a lot of layers. That may be the most dense episode I've delivered so far. Thanks for listening. In my next episode, I'm going to explore Romans 1 and 1 Corinthians 6 and 1 Timothy 1. Again, passages where Paul writes about Gentile sexual sins. And we're going to see that kind of detail outlined in today's episode will be highly relevant for our understanding of those texts, those biblical texts that the Orthodox and confessing churches today still heed. Thanks for listening. God bless and prosper and keep you. May His life and light and grace shine on you. Turn your brains on, everybody.